This is Matthew with CJSF Radio 90.1 FM. I am here doing an interview over Zoom with Professor Aaron Hoffman from the Political Science Department here at SFU. And we're just going to talk a little bit about this recent American intervention into Venezuela and just kind of talk a little bit about the political science impacts or the political impacts that we're seeing. So the first question I want to ask you, Professor Hoffman, is when you saw the news of this, I guess, extraordinary rendition, what were the first things that came through your mind?
Well, first of all, I guess I'll just say thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and your listeners about this issue. I was pretty surprised, actually, about the news when I first heard it, and I was not really sure what to think about it. I had probably up until that point been thinking that the Trump administration was trying to goad the Maduro administration in Venezuela into taking a provocative act that would allow the United States to then create a pretext for using force against Venezuela. But that is not, in fact, what happened. Venezuela basically kept its cool, and the U.S. decided to go in and remove Maduro from power anyway. And it's actually taken me a few days to think through what I think about this in terms of the policy. I've been spending time trying to think about reasons why the Trump administration might do this that would be justifiable and would make sense. And I've also been thinking about the other case. And I think it's been harder for me overall to come up with the positive case for this, the reasons why the US should have done this case.
Hmm. Hmm.
There are reasons, but I think that the weight of the evidence, in my view, at this point, leans more towards this is not going to really advance U.S. interests in a terrific way.
Right, in a meaningful way. And that I think is a great place for me to kind of start. Because one of the things that I was thinking about along this is that this second Trump presidency has really brought along some pretty dramatic shifts in American foreign policy. As a Canadian, I think that we can start with the commentary on the 51st state, and that really had a big impact in this recent election. There's also been a lot of very recent, over the past week or two, conversation from the American government about annexing Greenland. I think about the fact that in February of 2025, J.D. Vance gave the speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he was, very I don't know, antagonistic, I guess is one way to put it, towards the Europeans. And then in December 2025, there was the big national security strategy update, which also showed some shifts. So I just want to know, can you talk about these broader uncertainties and instability that America has kind of brought into our current world?
This is a great time for me to talk about this. Last semester, every fall semester, I teach a class on U.S. foreign policy, an upper division class. So for, third and fourth year students. And this past fall, the theme of the class was what is the second Trump administration up to in
Hmm.
foreign policy? And we were credibly debating a lot of different ways of thinking about the Trump foreign policy. And while I certainly had my suspicions as to what was going on, I definitely thought that there were some plausible alternative explanations for understanding what was happening. And I think this latest round of antagonistic behavior towards Venezuela clears a lot of things up, actually, in terms of what Trump is trying to do. I think it was easy prior to this to dismiss a lot of the provocative and unsettling talk about the 51st state acquiring Greenland, reacquiring the Panama Canal as a lot of bravado and an effort to try to keep people off balance, but not necessarily involving big changes in U.S. orientation towards the world. But I think that this move against Venezuela suggests that, in fact, the U.S. is intending to behave much more aggressively in its hemisphere than it has in a very long time, to kind of start to exert what we would in another era have called imperial power
Hmm.
in the Western Hemisphere, and that it now regards North and South America in particular, and maybe parts of Western Europe, as its his personal backyard. That's an old idea in U.S. foreign
Right.
policy. That's
I,
not new,
yeah,
but it's been a while since a U.S. president a presidency has really behaved that way
right.
towards its neighbors.
And I think that that's a great setup for me to introduct and bring up the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, because that's something that a lot of people have been talking about recently with, this current Trump behavior. And that was about curtailing European power in the Western Hemisphere in general. And so one of the things that has come up is people have thrown around this idea of a Monroe Doctrine, which is, the Donald Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine. I'm just curious, like, do you kind of see that there is such a doctrine being developed? And if so, what are the goals of this doctrine?
I don't know that I would want to call it the Donroe Doctrine.
Mm,
I think that's kind of a silly framing, but I understand what he's trying to do, and there are some parallels between what Trump is doing right now and the kind of the emphasis of the Monroe Doctrine of the 1800s. But there is also, I mean, the clearest connection between Trump and Monroe, the Donroe Doctrine and the Monroe Doctrine, if you will, is that the U.S. is asserting that it and it alone has the right to kind of govern relations within its hemisphere, and is telling other powers to stay out of the U.S.'s way in this area, in this region. The really important difference between the Monroe Doctrine and Trump's foreign policy is that the United States is a vastly more powerful country today than it was when Monroe made his proclamation.
mhm,
And in some ways, one can think of the Monroe Doctrine as more of a defensive effort to deal with the fact that the US was relatively weak compared to its European counterparts and was trying everything it possibly could to keep itself away from those countries and keep themselves away from those dangers. And you could read what Trump has done as being an effort to keep the U.S. away from Russia and China, but really the difference in capability, in economic power, in international influence, I think this looks much more like an offensive doctrine than a defensive one, and it may have some of the same effects as the Monroe Doctrine, but I think it also comes with a lot more threat to U.S. neighbors than than we might have imagined in the 1800s.
do you think this recent Venezuela attack is part of America expanding its own sphere of influence and power projection?
Yes and no. You know, no, the United States has always had the ability to project power throughout its region, and has done so, over the years. And I think that U.S. Unwelcome involvement in Latin America is nothing new. This is not the first time that the United States has deposed a Latin American leader. The difference is that the United States had for quite some time now been treating Latin America, Canada, Mexico, as equals, at least in the sense of so far as equal partners, even if they weren't necessarily equal militarily. But the attitude of the last several presidents has not been aggressive. It is a reorientation in the sense that the United States has now announced that both by attacking Venezuela, but also but also by threatening its traditional neighbors, that it's no longer safe for countries in the Western Hemisphere to believe that the United States is acting out of particular kinds of laudable values. Like this, there's no reason to think that this attack on Venezuela was done on any kind of humanitarian grounds or efforts to kind of advance the idea of democracy, to combat authoritarianism in the world. No, it was really to grab the leader of Venezuela, Maduro, to throw him out, throw him into jail, take control of Venezuela's oil, and then leave the rest of the Maduro regime in place. There's no talk of new elections. There's no talk of trying to move Venezuela towards democracy. So this is a very different orientation than the U.S. has taken in a long time.
I'm glad that you brought that up because one of the things that I also noticed was that this really wasn't a traditional regime change like in the past because Maduro's vice president has now taken over. We now have acting president Delcy Rodriguez. So I'm wondering, is that, in your view, America learning from past mistakes, or do you think that's something new or something different?
I think it's too soon to say. I've seen some what I would call optimistic views that suggest that this is just step one in what will be a multi-step process to try to bring about change in Venezuela. So no, they haven't talked about new elections because actually getting the Maduro regime to agree to that is essentially asking the regime to execute itself, right? To remove itself from power. That's a very hard thing to do, and so the only way to do that is in steps. And that the hope is at least that that's the kind of thing that Trump would be moving towards in the near future. The problem with that argument, I think, is just that Trump has not really shown any interest in trying to advance democracy, human rights, the rule of law, any of those things that presidents, since Ronald Reagan and even before, have said are important pieces of their foreign policy programs. So there appears to be no plan within the Trump administration to achieve those goals. Certainly, they could come up with one, but right now, the main goal seems to be to take control of Venezuelan oil and threaten Venezuela's new leadership or recycled leadership, whatever it is, until they basically start to do what the U.S. wants. And then if they do, then we pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done.
And this is kind of interesting because it brings into the conversation kind of another question about the confidence that we have to have in current American leadership and whether or not they have the type of vision that is necessary to bring about this kind of large scale change. One of the things that occurred to me, and I've also seen other people comment on this, is the idea that this is almost like a reverse domino theory, where it's kind of this is the first step to take out Cuba and other leftist regimes in Latin America, South America. Do you have any kind of thoughts or views on that?
Well, I certainly think that the Trump administration has expressed the hope, maybe more than the hope, that by knocking out Venezuela, that other troublesome actors in the region, according to the Trump administration, would start to fall, and Cuba was number one on the list. Um, I don't see this though specifically at the moment as an attack on left-wing governments, even though clearly that's what's happening. I think that the best way to understand this is an effort by the Trump administration to create a kind of change that we haven't seen in a long time, a change in which the great powers become fairly unrivaled in their regions. So it's a kind of a sphere of influence strategy. The U.S. is saying this is our neck of the woods. China, Russia, you get out. And the Trump administration has been signaling that it's prepared to maybe not play quite such a tough game in Asia, to kind of maybe let China meander about. So I think this is a change in the world that we know. It's not a change in terms of liberal values, but it would be a change in terms of the orientation of the great powers to their responsibilities and their sense of their places in the world.
Yeah, no, that's definitely an interesting thing because I was thinking about whether or not this kind of extraordinary rendition or abduction will embolden other nations. So the first things that came to my mind was, Russia's special military operation against Ukraine and kind of this idea that like Trump just demonstrated what it seems Vladimir Putin was hoping to do. And then also, obviously, China Taiwan comes to mind. And you brought up kind of this idea of whether or not America is realigning with respect to Asia. So, with those ideas, like, do you think that this will embolden other nations to use similar actions to solve their own regional problems?
I certainly think that that's quite possible. And if my reading of the situation is right, the Trump administration is going to take the attitude that similar sorts of actions in the regions that superpowers or great powers have the kind of the right to assert control over are not going to meet with the kinds of challenges that they might have from other administrations. Does that mean that Zelensky is likely to get plucked out of Ukraine by a Russian military operation? Well, I'm not. I mean, certainly I'd be worried if I was him.
Hmm.
But one thing that is important also to remember is that Venezuela and Ukraine are also different countries with different assets. Venezuela is a country whose two main kind of patrons or big allies. Russia is a failing military state, basically one that is struggling to project military power outside of its own region. And China was primarily a financial backer of Venezuela, providing loans and infrastructure kinds of a deal. They were not really providing a lot of military backing. That's not the case with Ukraine. Ukraine's important allies are giving Ukraine a lot of military support. That included the United States up until a little while ago. But European countries are defending Ukraine with military goods and hardware and intelligence. So I think that that provides a level of protection for Zelensky that Maduro did not enjoy.
Awesome. Professor Hoffman, I want to thank you for your time. This was really informative, and I hope that all of our viewers and listeners will find this to be enlightening. This is Matthew with CJSF Radio, 90.1 FM, broadcasting from Burnaby Mountain. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.